The summer of 1848 settled heavily over the lowlands of Mississippi, pressing humid air into the cotton fields until even the trees seemed to bow under its weight. On the night of July 17th, just after the moon climbed above the cypress line, a lantern was discovered swinging from a rope tied to the branch of an old pecan tree near the quarters. It moved slowly, back and forth, though the air was still. No wind stirred the leaves. No footsteps disturbed the dust below. Yet the lantern continued its gentle motion, casting long shadows across the packed earth, as if someone had only moments before stepped away and vanished into the darkness. Crescent moon. The plantation ledger would later mark that date with a faint smear of ink, an accidental stain beside a name that had been written many times before. The name belonged to a man known simply as Elijah. He was listed not as a doctor, not as a preacher, not as anything recognized by the laws of Mississippi, but as property. Age estimated at 38 years. Height 5 feet 9 inches. Condition noted as strong, though increasingly troublesome. Among the enslaved community, however, Elijah was known for something entirely different. He carried no official title, yet people walked miles through the night to seek his help. They came with fevers that burned through the body like wildfire, with wounds that refused to close, with children who coughed until their breath came in shallow gasps. He listened carefully, spoke quietly, and worked with steady hands. He gathered bark from willow trees, roots from the marsh edges, and leaves that most men ignored. He boiled them into dark liquids that smelled bitter and sharp. Sometimes the sick recovered within days. Sometimes they survived when everyone else believed they would die. No one on the plantation could remember when Elijah first began practicing his remedies. Older workers recalled seeing him as a young man studying plants along the riverbank, speaking softly to elders who carried knowledge from generations before bondage. He watched, listened, and memorized. Over time, he became the person others trusted when suffering arrived without warning. The plantation owner, Thomas Whitaker, tolerated Elijah's work at first. In the early years, the arrangement appeared convenient. When illness spread through the quarters, Elijah reduced the number of workers lost to disease. When children fell weak, he kept them alive long enough to grow into laborers. To Whitaker, survival meant productivity, and productivity meant profit. He allowed Elijah to continue, so long as the work remained quiet and did not interfere with field duties. But something changed during the winter of 1847. That season brought a sickness unlike any the plantation had seen. It began with chills and headaches, then progressed to violent trembling that left strong men unable to stand. Several overseers fell ill within the same week. One of them, a man named Caleb Dorsey, developed a fever so severe that he drifted in and out of consciousness, calling for water that he could not swallow. The plantation physician was summoned from the nearest town, traveling by carriage over muddy roads. He arrived carrying leather cases filled with glass bottles and metal instruments polished to a shine. For 2 days he bled the patients, administered powders, and issued strict instructions. None of it slowed the sickness. Dorsey's condition worsened until his breathing grew shallow and uneven. On the third night, with snow beginning to fall outside the cabin windows, Whitaker made a decision that would later echo across the plantation. He ordered Elijah to be brought from the quarters and told to do whatever he could. Witnesses described how Elijah entered the room quietly, removing his hat before stepping inside. He approached the bed, placed his hand gently against the overseer's forehead, and closed his eyes as if listening to something others could not hear. Then he requested hot water, clean cloth, and a bundle of dried bark from his personal supplies. For hours he worked without pause, mixing a thick, dark brew and coaxing the patient to drink small amounts at regular intervals. He wiped sweat from the man's face and spoke in low tones meant to steady the mind. By dawn, the trembling had slowed. By the following evening, the fever broke. The physician, who had remained nearby out of professional obligation, examined Dorsey again and found the man sitting upright, asking for food. The recovery stunned everyone present. Whitaker offered no public praise, yet observers noticed the tight expression on his face, as if relief had been accompanied by something darker, something he could not name. Word of the event spread quickly beyond the plantation boundaries. Nearby farms began sending messages requesting Elijah's assistance. Some arrived quietly after sunset, offering payment in coin or goods if he would travel to their property and treat the sick. Whitaker refused most of these requests, insisting that Elijah's time belonged to him alone. Still, rumors continued to circulate, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Within months, stories emerged claiming that Elijah possessed knowledge beyond ordinary medicine. Some whispered that he could sense illness before symptoms appeared. Others insisted he communicated with unseen forces that guided his hands. A few claimed he could bring a dying person back from the edge of death. None of these claims could be verified, yet they spread through the region with remarkable speed. Fear followed close behind. By early spring of 1848, several plantation owners began to express concern during private gatherings. They spoke in low voices over glasses of whiskey, questioning whether Elijah's influence might encourage rebellion or undermine authority. They worried that enslaved people who trusted a healer more than their masters might one day refuse orders. They debated whether such knowledge should be controlled, suppressed, or eliminated entirely. The conversation remained hidden from official records, but fragments survived in letters exchanged between neighboring landowners. One letter described Elijah as a dangerous figure whose presence invites unrest. Another warned that allowing him to continue could lead to consequences beyond calculation. The language carried an undercurrent of urgency, as though a quiet decision was forming behind closed doors. The first major incident occurred on a humid afternoon in June. A young woman named Sarah collapsed while picking cotton in the far field. Witnesses reported that she began shaking violently, then lost consciousness. The overseer ordered her carried to the shade, where she lay motionless, her breathing shallow and irregular. Elijah was summoned immediately. He arrived within minutes, kneeling beside her and examining her pulse. After a brief assessment, he instructed the workers to bring water mixed with crushed leaves from a plant growing near the irrigation ditch. Some hesitated, uncertain whether to leave their assigned rows without permission. Elijah repeated the request calmly, his voice steady. The remedy was prepared and administered. Within an hour, Sarah's breathing stabilized. By sunset, she regained consciousness and asked for food. The recovery should have ended the matter. Instead, it triggered a chain of events that would transform suspicion into open hostility. Later that evening, the overseer reported the incident to Whitaker, emphasizing how quickly Elijah had taken control of the situation. He described the workers gathering around the healer, watching his every movement, waiting for his instructions rather than the overseer's commands. He noted how their attention shifted, how authority seemed to change hands in that brief moment. Whitaker listened without interruption. When the report ended, he dismissed the overseer and remained alone in his study for several hours. Servants passing the doorway noticed the sound of packing, measured footsteps crossing the wooden floor again and again. It was after midnight when Whitaker finally extinguished the lamp and stepped outside. The sky was clear, stars scattered across the darkness. He walked slowly toward the quarters, stopping near the pecan tree where the lantern would later be found. There, according to one witness who observed from a distance, he stood motionless for several minutes, staring toward Elijah's cabin. No words were exchanged, no orders were given, yet the stillness carried a sense of calculation, as though a decision had quietly settled into place. From that point forward, subtle changes appeared across the plantation. Elijah noticed them first in the way conversations stopped when he approached. Workers who once greeted him openly began speaking in whispers. Overseers watched him more closely, recording his movements in small notebooks carried at their belts. Even Whitaker's tone shifted, growing colder during routine interactions. Then came the discovery that marked the beginning of open conflict. One morning, Elijah returned to his cabin after tending to a sick child and found his collection of medicinal plants scattered across the floor. Bundles of dried leaves had been torn open. Glass jars lay shattered against the wall. The wooden chest that stored his tools stood overturned, its contents spilled into the dirt. No one admitted responsibility. No explanation was offered. Elijah gathered the damaged supplies in silence, carefully salvaging what remained. Those who observed him later described a change in his expression. Not anger, not fear, but a quiet recognition that the balance protecting him had begun to collapse. It was during the investigation that followed this destruction that the first direct threat surfaced. A stable hand reported overhearing two overseers speaking near the barn after sunset. Their voices were low, but certain phrases carried clearly through the still air. One man asked how long Whitaker intended to tolerate the healer's influence. The other responded with a statement that would later appear in sworn testimony. He said in a steady voice that accidents happen every day on plantations. People fell from wagons. Horses kicked without warning. Illness struck suddenly and without mercy. And sometimes, he added, men who caused trouble simply disappeared. The stable hand remained hidden until the conversation ended. He waited several minutes before returning to the quarters, where he shared what he had heard with trusted friends. The story spread quickly, moving from cabin to cabin like a slow-burning fuse. Days later, Elijah received a message delivered by a young boy carrying a folded scrap of paper. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the ink uneven, as if written in haste. The note contained only a single sentence. It read, "Leave this place before the harvest moon rises." The warning marked the first clear evidence that someone intended to remove him permanently. It was also the moment when the situation shifted from suspicion to active planning. Investigators reviewing the case years later would identify this message as the turning point, the point at which fear hardened into determination. Magnifying glass tilted left. If you appreciate detailed investigations like this, you're watching Grave Files. Subscribe and join us for more real case deep dives. From that night forward, Elijah began documenting everything he observed. He noted unusual movements near his cabin, unfamiliar footprints in the soil, and changes in routine that suggested preparation for something larger. He shared these observations quietly with a small circle of trusted individuals, urging them to remain alert. Meanwhile, Whitaker initiated a series of meetings with neighboring landowners, gathering them in his study under the pretense of discussing crop yields and market prices. Witnesses reported that the discussions often lasted late into the night, their tone serious and deliberate. Papers were exchanged. Maps were unfolded across the table. Decisions were reached behind closed doors. No official record of those meetings survives, yet later testimony suggests they centered on a single objective: restoring control over a situation they believed had grown dangerous. As summer deepened and the air grew heavier, tension settled across the plantation like an approaching storm. Workers moved cautiously, avoiding unnecessary attention. Overseers maintained constant surveillance, their presence felt in every corner of the property. Even the animals seemed unsettled, reacting to subtle changes in human behavior. And then, on the evening of July 17th, the lantern appeared beneath the pecan tree, swinging gently in the still air, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground like silent warnings. Balance. The lantern continued to sway beneath the pecan tree long after the first witness noticed it. The man who discovered it, an elderly field hand named Moses, had stepped outside shortly after midnight to fetch water from the barrel near the well. He later described the moment with careful precision, repeating the same details each time he was questioned. The night was unusually quiet. No insects hummed. No owls called from the woods. Even the distant frogs along the marsh seemed to have fallen silent, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Moses stood still for several seconds, watching the lantern move. Its glow traced a slow arc across the ground, illuminating the dust in brief flashes before fading again into shadow. He noticed that the rope holding it was new, lighter in color than the bark of the tree, and tied with a knot he did not recognize. The sight unsettled him, though he could not immediately explain why. He set the bucket down carefully, wiped his hands against his trousers, and walked closer. As he approached, he saw something else resting at the base of the tree. A small wooden crate lay partially hidden in the tall grass, its lid secured with iron nails. The surface bore faint scratches as though it had been dragged across rough ground. He crouched slowly, reached out and pressed his palm against the wood. It felt warm, not from sunlight but from recent handling. Moses hesitated. Years of experience had taught him that certain objects carried danger simply by their presence. He straightened, turned away from the crate and walked back toward the quarters without touching it again. Moments later, he began knocking on doors, waking others one by one, his voice low but urgent. Within minutes, a small group gathered beneath the tree. They stood in a loose circle, keeping a cautious distance from the crate. Some whispered prayers. Others watched the shadows for movement. No one dared open the box. The lantern continued its steady motion overhead, creaking softly with each swing. News of the discovery reached the overseer before dawn. He arrived on horseback, accompanied by 2 assistants carrying rifles. Witnesses later described how he dismounted without speaking, his boots striking the ground with deliberate force. He examined the lantern first, tracing the rope upward to the branch where it had been secured. Then he stepped toward the crate, bent down, and inspected the nails sealing its lid. For several long seconds, he remained motionless. Finally, he ordered the men to pry the box open. One assistant retrieved a crowbar from the supply shed and forced it beneath the edge of the lid. The wood groaned as the nails loosened. With a sharp crack, the seal broke, and the lid lifted just enough to reveal the contents inside. Those standing closest would later describe the smell that escaped first, a heavy, bitter odor that stung the nose and settled into the throat. It carried hints of crushed herbs, damp earth, and something else more difficult to identify. The overseer stepped back immediately, covering his mouth with a cloth. Inside the crate rested several bundles wrapped in cloth strips. Each bundle was tied tightly with twine and marked with small symbols drawn in dark ink. The shapes resembled leaves, roots, and curved lines arranged in patterns no one present could interpret. Tucked between the bundles lay a folded piece of parchment. The overseer removed the parchment carefully, unfolding it with slow, deliberate movements. Witnesses strained to see the writing, but he kept the page angled away from the group. His eyes scanned the lines once, then again, lingering on certain words. His expression changed. Without reading the message aloud, he folded the parchment and placed it inside his coat pocket. Then he ordered the crate carried to the main house and instructed everyone else to return to their duties immediately. His voice carried an edge of urgency that left no room for questions. The crowd dispersed slowly, whispering among themselves. Some believed the bundles contained medicine prepared by Elijah. Others feared they were something more dangerous, evidence of forbidden knowledge that plantation owners had long sought to control. Elijah himself learned of the discovery shortly after sunrise. A young girl who had witnessed the scene ran to his cabin, breathless and wide-eyed, repeating fragments of what she had seen. He listened quietly, asking only a few clarifying questions. When she finished, he nodded once and dismissed her gently. Those who observed him afterward noted a deep stillness in his posture. He did not rush to the tree or demand explanations. Instead, he gathered a small leather satchel, placed several tools inside, and stepped outside to survey the property from a distance. His gaze lingered on the main house, where the crate had been taken. He seemed to understand that events were moving beyond his control. Later that morning, Whitaker summoned the overseer to his study. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. No servants were allowed inside, and the door remained closed throughout the conversation. However, one kitchen worker passing through the hallway reported hearing raised voices, not shouting, but sharp, tense exchanges punctuated by long periods of silence. When the overseer finally emerged, his face appeared pale, his movements stiff. He walked directly to the stable yard and ordered a horse prepared for immediate travel. Within minutes, he rode toward the nearest town, carrying the crate and its contents in a covered wagon. By afternoon, rumors spread that the parchment found inside the box contained a list of names. Some claimed the names belonged to sick workers who had received Elijah's treatments. Others insisted they were the names of plantation owners across the region. No one could confirm the truth, yet the uncertainty fueled growing anxiety. That evening, Whitaker called an assembly of all workers near the central yard. The gathering was unusual, occurring after sunset when labor normally ended and families prepared their evening meals. Lanterns were hung along the fence, casting a dull yellow light across the crowd. Whitaker stood on the wooden platform used for announcements, his posture rigid, his hands clasped behind his back. He spoke in measured tones, explaining that certain unauthorized activities had been discovered on the property. He warned that any practice involving unapproved remedies, gatherings, or written records would be considered a violation of plantation rules. His words carried a clear message, though Elijah's name was never spoken. The crowd listened in silence. Some lowered their eyes. Others watched Whitaker carefully, searching for clues in his expression. When the speech ended, he dismissed them without further explanation and returned to the main house. Night settled over the plantation once again, thick and oppressive. Clouds drifted across the sky, blocking the moonlight and leaving the fields in near darkness. Most workers remained inside their cabins, speaking quietly with family members about the events of the day. Shortly before midnight, a second disturbance occurred. A loud crash echoed from the direction of the storage barn, followed by the frantic whinnying of horses. Several men rushed outside to investigate, carrying lanterns and tools. As they approached the building, they saw smoke rising from the roofline, curling upward into the night. Flames flickered along the wooden beams near the entrance. Buckets of water were passed hand to hand in desperate attempts to contain the fire. The effort continued for nearly an hour before the flames were finally extinguished. By then, a section of the barn wall had collapsed, leaving a blackened gap that exposed the interior. Inside the debris, investigators discovered something unexpected. Near the center of the floor lay a pile of burned cloth and shattered glass bottles. The remains resembled the supplies Elijah kept in his cabin, jars used for storing herbs, containers for mixing remedies, and strips of fabric for wrapping medicine bundles. Yet Elijah insisted he had not placed them there. The discovery raised immediate suspicion. Some believed the fire had been set intentionally to destroy evidence. Others feared it was an attempt to frame Elijah for an act of sabotage. The uncertainty deepened the sense of danger spreading across the plantation. Before dawn, Whitaker ordered guards stationed near Elijah's cabin. Their instructions were simple: observe his movements and report any unusual behavior. The presence of armed men outside his door signaled a shift from quiet surveillance to open control. Elijah acknowledged the guards calmly, offering no resistance. He continued his routine as before, tending to the sick and preparing remedies with steady hands. Yet those who watched closely noticed subtle changes, longer pauses before speaking, more frequent glances toward the horizon, as if measuring distance and time. Meanwhile, the overseer returned from town with new instructions from local authorities. A formal inquiry would begin immediately. Officials planned to examine the contents of the crate, question witnesses, and determine whether illegal activities had taken place on the plantation. The announcement spread quickly, igniting fresh waves of fear. For many, the investigation represented more than a search for truth. It signaled the possibility that Elijah's knowledge, the very skill that had saved countless lives, might now be used against him. And as the first light of dawn crept across the fields, casting pale shadows over the damaged barn and the silent pecan tree, a quiet realization settled among those who understood the situation best. Someone had begun constructing a case, not to discover what had happened, but to justify what would happen next. The morning of July 18th arrived without ceremony, yet the atmosphere across the plantation carried a weight that every person could feel. A thin layer of fog rested over the fields, clinging to the ground as if reluctant to rise. Workers moved slowly toward their assigned rows, their footsteps muted by damp soil. Conversation was scarce. Even routine sounds, the creak of wagon wheels, the snap of leather reins, seemed subdued, as though the land itself recognized that something irreversible had begun. Shortly after sunrise, a carriage approached from the eastern road, its dark silhouette emerging through the mist. The horses maintained a steady pace, hooves striking the earth in measured rhythm. Two riders followed close behind, both dressed in formal coats despite the rising heat. Their arrival drew quiet attention from those in the fields, who paused briefly before lowering their heads and returning to work. The carriage stopped in front of the main house. A man stepped down first, adjusting his hat before surveying the property with a slow, deliberate gaze. His name was recorded later as Deputy Marshal Jonathan Pierce, an official sent from the county seat to oversee the inquiry. He carried himself with rigid posture, his movements precise, his expression unreadable. Behind him descended a second man, thinner and slightly older, holding a leather case filled with documents. This individual introduced himself as Clerk Samuel Wren, responsible for recording testimony and maintaining official records of the investigation. Neither man spoke immediately. They stood side by side, observing the plantation in silence for nearly a full minute. Their eyes moved across the fields, the cabins, the distant tree line. Finally, Pierce turned toward Whitaker, who had been waiting on the porch since before dawn. The two men exchanged a brief handshake, followed by a quiet conversation that remained beyond the hearing of those nearby. Moments later, the clerk opened his case and removed a stack of papers tied with twine. He untied the bundle carefully, smoothing each sheet against the wooden railing before preparing his ink and pen. The act signaled the official beginning of proceedings. Word spread quickly that questioning would start at once. The first witnesses called were those who had discovered the lantern and crate beneath the pecan tree. Moses was escorted to the porch by an armed guard, his hands trembling slightly as he climbed the steps. Observers later recalled the careful way he removed his hat before speaking, holding it against his chest, as if drawing strength from the familiar gesture. Pierce asked his questions in a steady, neutral tone. He requested the exact time of discovery. He asked whether Moses had touched the crate. He inquired about any unusual sounds or movements observed during the night. Moses answered slowly, repeating details with careful precision. He described the stillness of the air, the motion of the lantern, the warmth of the wooden box. He insisted that he had not opened the crate or disturbed its contents. His voice remained calm, though witnesses noted a faint tremor in his hands throughout the exchange. The clerk recorded every word. When the questioning ended, Moses was dismissed without comment. He stepped down from the porch and returned to the quarters, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if carrying an invisible burden. One by one, additional witnesses were summoned. Several confirmed seeing the lantern swaying in the darkness. Others described the smell released when the crate was opened. A few reported noticing unfamiliar footprints near the tree, though none could identify who had left them. Each statement added another layer to the growing record, yet none provided a clear explanation for the events that had taken place. By mid-morning, the focus of the inquiry shifted. Deputy Pierce requested that Elijah be brought forward. The order traveled quickly across the property. A guard approached Elijah's cabin and delivered the message without ceremony. Elijah listened quietly, then nodded once and stepped outside. He wore a simple cotton shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and carried no tools or supplies. His posture remained upright, his expression composed. As he walked toward the main house, workers paused to watch. Some lowered their eyes in silent respect. Others followed at a distance, careful not to draw attention. The path from the quarters to the porch stretched longer than usual, each step measured against the weight of uncertainty. When Elijah reached the base of the stairs, he stopped briefly and looked upward. Pierce stood at the top, hands clasped behind his back, studying the man before him. Their eyes met for a moment, a silent exchange that neither witness nor record could fully capture. Then Elijah climbed the steps. The questioning began immediately. Pierce asked about Elijah's knowledge of the crate and its contents. He asked whether Elijah had prepared the bundles discovered inside. He asked whether Elijah had written the symbols marked on the cloth. Elijah answered each question calmly, his voice steady and deliberate. He acknowledged preparing herbal remedies for the sick. He confirmed using cloth wrappings to preserve medicines. He explained that certain markings helped him identify ingredients quickly during emergencies. However, he denied placing the crate beneath the tree. He denied writing the parchment found inside. He insisted that the materials discovered in the barn fire did not belong to him. The exchange continued for nearly an hour. Pierce listened carefully, occasionally glancing toward the clerk to ensure each response was recorded accurately. At times he paused, studying Elijah's face as if searching for signs of deception. Yet Elijah's composure never wavered. Observers later remarked on the unusual stillness surrounding the porch during that conversation. Even the wind seemed to recede, leaving the air thick and motionless. Finally, Pierce asked a question that shifted the tone of the inquiry. He inquired whether Elijah had ever been instructed by others to share his knowledge beyond the plantation. A faint murmur moved through the gathered crowd. Elijah hesitated for the first time. Not long, only a few seconds, but long enough for the change to be noticed. Then he answered. He stated that people from neighboring properties had occasionally requested his help when illness spread beyond their control. He admitted traveling to assist them when permission was granted. He emphasized that his purpose had always been to preserve life, not to challenge authority. The response was recorded without comment. Yet those watching sensed that the investigation had reached a critical point. Pierce closed his notebook slowly and stepped back from the table. He thanked Elijah for his cooperation and instructed him to remain available for further questioning. The dismissal carried an undercurrent of restraint, as though a final decision had been postponed rather than avoided. Elijah descended the stairs and returned toward the quarters, his pace unchanged. Behind him, the inquiry continued. Shortly after noon, Deputy Pierce requested access to Elijah's cabin. Whitaker granted permission immediately, ordering guards to escort the officials to the location. A small group followed at a distance, careful to remain beyond the line of authority. Inside the cabin, investigators conducted a methodical search. They examined shelves lined with jars containing dried leaves and powdered bark. They inspected bundles of roots hanging from wooden beams. They opened drawers filled with cloth strips and handwritten notes. Each item was handled with deliberate caution, as though it might reveal hidden meaning. At the back of the room, Pierce discovered a narrow wooden chest partially concealed beneath a blanket. He knelt slowly, lifted the lid, and peered inside. Witnesses could not see the contents clearly, but they observed his reaction. His shoulders stiffened. His breathing slowed. Then he reached into the chest and removed a small leather-bound notebook. The cover appeared worn from years of use, edges softened by repeated handling. He opened the pages carefully, scanning lines of tightly written text. The symbols resembled those found on the bundles in the crate, small marks arranged in patterns that suggested careful organization. The clerk stepped closer, dipping his pen into ink as he prepared to document the discovery. Pierce turned several pages in silence. Then he stopped, his eyes fixed on a particular entry near the center of the notebook. He read the lines once, then again, his expression growing increasingly serious. Without speaking, he closed the book and held it firmly in his hands. Those present sensed that the investigation had uncovered something significant. Not proof of guilt, but information capable of changing the direction of the entire case. Outside the cabin, the afternoon sun burned through the remaining fog, casting sharp shadows across the ground. Workers watched from a distance, their attention fixed on the doorway. No one spoke. No one moved. Minutes later, Pierce stepped outside carrying the notebook. He paused on the threshold and looked across the plantation, toward the pecan tree, the burned barn, and the silent rows of cotton stretching to the horizon. Then he issued a single instruction. Elijah was to be detained until further notice. The order spread through the crowd like a sudden gust of wind, stirring fear and disbelief in equal measure. Guards approached cautiously, positioning themselves on either side of Elijah. He did not resist. He simply extended his hands, allowing them to secure his wrists with iron restraints. As they led him away, the sun dipped lower in the sky, its light turning deep orange against the distant fields. And for the first time since the investigation began, a realization settled over the plantation with undeniable clarity. The search for answers had ended. The preparation for judgment had begun. The restraints closed around Elijah's wrists with a dull metallic click that echoed farther than anyone expected. The sound carried across the yard and into the rows of cotton, where workers paused mid-motion, their hands frozen around stalks and baskets. No order had been given to stop, yet the rhythm of labor slowed almost instantly, replaced by a quiet, watchful stillness. Elijah did not struggle. Witnesses later described how he stood upright, shoulders relaxed, his gaze steady as the guards secured the iron cuffs. His breathing remained slow and controlled, as if he had prepared for this moment long before it arrived. The deputy marshal observed him carefully, noting the absence of panic, the lack of protest. It was an unusual reaction for a man placed under arrest without formal charges. The guards began escorting him toward the storage shed near the edge of the property, a small wooden structure typically used for holding tools and damaged equipment. That day, it had been cleared of supplies and fitted with a heavy iron latch on the door. The modification had been completed quietly during the early morning hours, before most workers realized its purpose. As Elijah walked across the yard, a path opened ahead of him. People stepped aside without being told. Some lowered their heads in silent acknowledgement. Others watched openly, their expressions tense and uncertain. A few whispered prayers under their breath, the words barely audible above the crunch of gravel beneath boots. At the threshold of the shed, the lead guard paused and opened the door. The interior was dim, lit only by a narrow beam of sunlight entering through a small crack in the wall. Dust floated in the air, drifting slowly in the heat. A wooden chair sat against the far side, its legs uneven, its surface worn smooth from years of use. There were no windows, no bedding, no water barrel, only bare walls and the faint smell of oil and rust. Elijah stepped inside without hesitation. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, followed by the sharp slide of the iron bolt. The sound marked the end of movement and the beginning of confinement. Outside, Deputy Pierce turned to Whitaker and spoke quietly, his voice low enough to prevent others from hearing. The conversation lasted only a few seconds, yet observers noticed the tension in Whitaker's posture. The rigid set of his jaw, the tight grip of his hands clasped behind his back. Moments later, Pierce instructed the clerk to prepare formal documentation of detention. The clerk opened his leather case, removed a sheet of parchment, and began writing with slow, deliberate strokes. Each line formed the legal framework that would justify holding Elijah without immediate trial. The document listed the reasons for detention in precise language: suspicion of unauthorized medical practice, possession of unregistered written materials, potential incitement of unrest among plantation laborers. The wording carried the authority of law, yet those who read it later would note the absence of direct evidence. The charges rested on inference, on interpretation, on fear rather than proof. As the paperwork progressed, a second team of investigators continued examining Elijah's belongings inside the cabin. They worked methodically, cataloging each item and placing it into labeled sacks. Jars of herbs were sealed in cloth. Bundles of dried roots were wrapped in paper. The leather-bound notebook discovered earlier remained in Pierce's possession, guarded closely as the most significant piece of evidence. One investigator focused on a narrow shelf near the rear wall, where several small bottles stood in careful arrangement. Each contained a dark liquid, thick and opaque, with a bitter scent that lingered in the air. The man removed the cork from one bottle and leaned closer, inhaling cautiously. He recoiled almost immediately. The smell triggered a sharp reaction, causing his eyes to water and his throat to tighten. He replaced the cork quickly and stepped back, wiping his face with a cloth. The reaction was recorded in the official log, described as evidence of potent substance with unknown properties. Outside the cabin, a group of workers gathered quietly, watching the search unfold. They spoke in low voices, sharing fragments of memory about Elijah's treatments, stories of children saved from fever, of wounds healed after accidents in the fields, of illnesses that had once threatened entire families. Each account carried a tone of gratitude mixed with growing fear. By late afternoon, the sun pressed down heavily on the property, turning the air thick and oppressive. The investigation showed no sign of slowing. Officials moved from building to building, examining storage areas, questioning supervisors, and reviewing plantation records dating back several years. One ledger drew particular attention. It contained detailed notes documenting sickness among workers, dates, symptoms, and outcomes. In many entries, the physician's name appeared briefly, followed by a second notation indicating Elijah's involvement. The pattern revealed something unexpected. Recovery rates increased significantly after Elijah began treating patients. The observation unsettled investigators. On one hand, it demonstrated the effectiveness of his methods. On the other, it suggested a level of influence that plantation authorities found difficult to control. The discovery intensified concerns that his reputation might undermine traditional systems of authority. As evening approached, Deputy Pierce requested a private meeting with Whitaker inside the main house. Servants were dismissed from the room, and the door closed firmly behind them. Those passing in the hallway later reported hearing muffled conversation, punctuated by long pauses and the occasional scrape of furniture against the floor. The meeting lasted nearly an hour. When Pierce finally emerged, his expression had hardened. He walked directly toward the shed where Elijah was being held, accompanied by 2 guards and the clerk carrying additional documents. A small crowd gathered at a distance, sensing that another development was imminent. The door to the shed opened slowly. Elijah remained seated on the wooden chair, hands resting calmly in his lap. The dim light cast shadows across his face, yet his posture remained composed. He looked up as the officials entered, acknowledging their presence without speaking. Pierce stepped forward and unfolded a sheet of parchment. He read the contents aloud in a measured tone. The statement declared that Elijah would remain in custody pending further investigation into suspected violations of plantation law and regional statutes. It also authorized the confiscation of all materials related to his medical practice until their safety could be determined. The words echoed against the bare wooden walls, filling the small space with formal authority. When the reading ended, Pierce lowered the document and studied Elijah's reaction. There was none. No protest. No plea. Only quiet acceptance. The deputy marshal hesitated briefly, then asked a single question. He inquired whether Elijah wished to make a statement in his defense. The silence that followed stretched for several seconds. Finally, Elijah spoke. His voice was calm, steady, and remarkably clear despite the heat and confinement. He stated that every remedy he had prepared was intended to preserve life. He explained that knowledge of plants and healing had been passed down through generations, carried carefully from one person to another. He insisted that his work had never been meant to challenge authority or inspire rebellion. He paused. Then he added one final sentence. He said that illness did not recognize rank or ownership, and that healing should not be feared. The statement was recorded verbatim. Outside the shed, dusk settled across the plantation, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple. Workers returned to their cabins, their movements slow and subdued. The usual sounds of evening, laughter, conversation, the clatter of cooking pots were noticeably absent. Instead, a heavy silence spread through the quarters. Late that night, long after most lights had been extinguished, an unexpected visitor approached the shed. The figure moved quietly along the edge of the yard, keeping to the shadows cast by nearby buildings. He paused several times, scanning the area for guards. Finding none within immediate range, he stepped closer to the door and tapped softly against the wood. Inside, Elijah lifted his head. The tap came again, 3 gentle knocks in steady rhythm. Elijah rose from the chair and approached the door, stopping just short of touching it. He listened carefully, recognizing the pattern. It was not random. It carried meaning, a signal used among trusted friends when secrecy was required. A whisper followed from the other side. The voice was low, urgent, and trembling with restrained fear. It delivered only a few words. "They have decided," the whisper said. "The order will come before sunrise." The footsteps retreated immediately, fading into the darkness before Elijah could respond. He remained standing in the dim interior, listening to the silence that followed. Outside, the night air grew cooler, and clouds drifted slowly across the sky, covering the stars one by one. Inside the shed, Elijah returned to the chair and sat down carefully, his expression unchanged. Yet those who would later study the case believed that, in that quiet moment, he understood the full meaning of the warning. The investigation was no longer about evidence. It was about conclusion. And the final decision had already been made. The hours before sunrise passed slowly, marked only by the faint creak of wood as the night air cooled the buildings and the distant rustle of wind moving through the cotton fields. Inside the shed, Elijah remained seated on the uneven chair, his back straight, his hands resting loosely against his knees. He did not sleep. Guards who checked the door at intervals reported seeing him in the same position each time, eyes open, gaze fixed on the narrow beam of moonlight slipping through the crack in the wall. Beyond the yard, the plantation lay in uneasy silence. Families in the quarters spoke in hushed voices, careful not to draw attention. Some packed small bundles of belongings, uncertain whether they would be forced to move. Others prayed quietly, their whispers blending into the darkness. A sense of finality settled over the property, as if everyone understood that the coming morning would change something that could not be restored. Shortly after 4 o'clock, a lantern appeared near the main house. Its light moved steadily across the yard, accompanied by the sound of measured footsteps. Deputy Pierce walked at the front, holding the lantern high enough to illuminate the path ahead. Behind him came Whitaker and two additional men dressed in dark coats, their collars raised against the chill. The group spoke briefly near the well, their voices low and deliberate. One of the men carried a folded document sealed with wax. When the conversation ended, they turned together toward the shed. A guard stepped forward and removed the iron bar securing the door. The metal scraped loudly against the latch, breaking the stillness of the early morning. Inside, Elijah rose from the chair before the door opened, as if he had been expecting the moment. The lantern light spilled into the room, casting long shadows across the walls. Pierce entered first and unfolded the sealed document. The clerk followed close behind, pen already poised above paper. Whitaker remained just outside the doorway, his face partially hidden in shadow. The deputy began reading. The statement declared that Elijah had been found in violation of plantation regulations concerning unauthorized practices and possession of unapproved materials. It further stated that his continued presence posed a risk to order and discipline. Based on these findings, the document authorized immediate removal from the property under the supervision of local authorities. The language was formal, precise, and final. No mention was made of trial. No opportunity for defense was offered. When the reading ended, the deputy lowered the document and looked directly at Elijah. He asked whether Elijah understood the order being delivered. Elijah nodded once. His voice, when he spoke, remained calm. He said that he understood. The guard stepped forward and secured his wrists again, this time attaching a length of chain between the cuffs. The metal clinked softly as they guided him out of the shed and into the open yard. The sky above had begun to lighten, shifting from black to deep gray. A thin band of pale color appeared along the horizon. Workers in the quarters sensed movement and began emerging from their cabins. They gathered silently near the fence line, watching as Elijah was led across the property. No one spoke. No one cried out. The quiet carried more weight than any protest could have. At the edge of the yard, a wagon waited. Its wooden frame stood motionless beside the road, harnessed to two horses already prepared for travel. A driver sat on the bench, holding the reins with steady hands. The wheels had been reinforced with iron bands, suggesting a journey over long distance rather than a short transfer to town. The deputy motioned for Elijah to climb aboard. Elijah paused briefly before stepping onto the wagon. He turned his head once, scanning the rows of cabins and the faces gathered near the fence. Witnesses later described the look in his eyes as neither fearful nor defiant, but reflective, as though he were committing the scene to memory. Then he took his seat. The chain between his wrists rested across his lap, glinting faintly in the growing light. Pierce signaled the driver. The horses shifted forward, hooves pressing into the dirt road. The wagon began to move slowly at first, its wheels creaking under the weight. Dust rose behind it in a thin cloud, drifting across the yard and settling over the ground where Elijah had stood only moments before. The procession continued down the road without interruption. People watched until the wagon disappeared beyond the tree line, swallowed by the distance and the early morning haze. Only then did the crowd begin to disperse, returning to their cabins and fields with heavy steps. No official announcement followed. No explanation was offered regarding Elijah's destination. Days passed, then weeks. Life on the plantation resumed its routine, yet something fundamental had changed. Illness returned more frequently, spreading through the quarters with renewed force. Without Elijah's remedies, fevers lasted longer. Wounds healed slowly. Children who might once have recovered began to fade. The plantation physician attempted to fill the gap, but his treatments produced inconsistent results. Records from that period show a steady increase in mortality, particularly among the youngest and oldest workers. The numbers appeared in neat columns of ink, Yet behind each entry lay a family marked by loss. Rumors circulated about Elijah's fate. Some claimed he had been transported to a distant plantation along the river, where his knowledge would remain hidden under strict supervision. Others believed he had been placed in a county jail, accused of practicing medicine without license. A few whispered darker possibilities, that he had been taken into the woods and never returned. No record confirmed any version. Months later, Deputy Pierce submitted his final report to the county office. The document summarized the investigation in concise language, stating that necessary actions had been taken to preserve order and prevent unrest. It listed confiscated materials, witness statements, and property inspections. The report concluded with a single sentence declaring the matter resolved. The file was closed. Years passed. Seasons changed, crops rose and fell, and ownership of the plantation eventually transferred to new hands. Buildings were repaired, fences replaced, and fields expanded. Yet among the people who lived and worked there, memory preserved details that official records ignored. They remembered the quiet man who listened carefully before speaking. They remembered the bitter smell of herbs boiling over a small fire. They remembered the steady hands that cooled fevers and closed wounds. Most of all, they remembered the morning when the wagon carried him away. Long after the investigation ended, travelers passing through the region reported hearing stories about a healer who had once saved lives across the countryside. Some described seeing a figure walking along riverbanks at dusk, gathering plants beneath fading light. Others spoke of unexpected recoveries in distant settlements, attributing them to remedies prepared by an unknown man who refused payment and vanished before dawn. None of these accounts could be verified. Yet the stories persisted, moving quietly from one generation to the next. In later years, historians reviewing plantation documents discovered the leather-bound notebook taken from Elijah's cabin. Its pages contained careful observations about plants, symptoms, and treatments recorded over many seasons. Margins held small symbols marking successful remedies, adjustments, and warnings about dangerous mixtures. The final entry, written only days before his arrest, appeared near the back of the book. It contained a brief sentence in steady handwriting. The words read, "Knowledge carried in silence can still keep people alive." After that line, the pages remained blank. No signature followed. No final explanation was given. The mystery surrounding his disappearance remained unresolved, leaving behind a question that history never answered. Not whether Elijah possessed unusual knowledge. Not whether his remedies worked. But whether fear of that knowledge proved more powerful than the lives it saved. And in the quiet fields of Mississippi, where the wind still moves through tall grass and old trees cast long shadows at sunset, the story endures not as a legend, but as a reminder of how easily truth can vanish when authority decides it is inconvenient to remember.